Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grimflayer. Hope you're all doing very well today, and we are here for an Abzan Stoneblade deck tech. That's right, Abzan Stoneblade in Modern. Still a little bit hard to believe, but very, very exciting. So, yeah, this is just going to be your basic deck tech. We're going to explain what the deck is up to, why I have made some of the decisions that I've made, and then eventually we will perhaps play this exact 75 through a league. Now, of course, this is a channel for those of you who might not watch the rock content but have been drawn in by the prospect of a Stoneblade deck tech. This is a channel where I'm very interactive with the viewers. I listen to all feedback. I take it all into consideration. So if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear it, especially because I want to make this caveat. I am not an experienced Abzan player at all, but I do have hundreds and hundreds of rock matches under my belt with a deck very much like this, just without the white, right? So all of those skills, all of that knowledge does translate, and bringing that knowledge to bear and looking around at some lists that other people have made, asking a question or two of certain groups, has led me to this list. So you'll have to let me know, of course, what you think, but let's get right into the deck tech. So as with any good deck, we need to begin by looking at the land base. So I'm a little bit hedged. I'm not really playing four of anything except Verdant Catacombs, really. We've got a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So we do have 4 fast lands, but 3 are Blooming Marsh, 1 is a Concealed Courtyard. You do see lists with 4 Marsh. I decided to mix it up a little bit because we need more white sources in our life, more on that later, and also because I want to not be pricing myself into a turn 2 activation of silent clearing all that often. I've seen lists with 4 Marsh and 2 clearing. Looks to me like we're going to be needing the clearing to cast our Stoneforge Mystic a little bit too often for my taste, so we mix that up a little bit. We've, of course, got 4 shock lands, 2 being a tomb, 1 shrine, 1 garden. We've got 8 total fetch lands, 4 Verdant Catacombs, 3 marsh flats, and 1 beautiful onslaught, Windswept Heath, and that seems to me to be the optimal breakdown, with the order of priority being black-green, followed by black-white, followed by green-white. And, of course, we do have 4 basic lands as well. The Onslaught Plains, gotta keep the sets matching, right? So we're playing a basic Plains, 2 Swamp. This is all fairly typical BGX stuff. Where it gets a little bit interesting is in first, the utility land column, and secondly, the overall breakdown of mana sources. But we have a little bit of everything here. We have 1 Shambling Vent and 1 Treetop Village. So the Treetop Village, I'll be straight up, is a little bit of a greedy inclusion, but it is just a very, very good land to equip. Not only because it has Trample, therefore pseudo-evasion, therefore is more likely to connect with Sword of Fire and Ice. It's also a very good land in its own right, just like in a vacuum, a very nice land. And it has a low activation cost, meaning it is more realistic to actually be able to animate it and then equip it all on the same turn without it being like turn 18. So hence the powerful but potentially greedy inclusion of Treetop Village. But those are our 2 creature lands, and we also have the aforementioned Silent Clearing and a Nurturing Peatland. Again, this split goes along with the Concealed Courtyard split to give us kind of the highest likelihood of not having to use these lands early on. Of course, the beauty of them is that you can use them if you need to, but then you can crack them for more gas, which in a deck that goes long like ours and a deck that is prone to potentially flooding out like ours, they're a very, very powerful tool. So I really like this as a jumping off point for the land base. The overall breakdown of mana sources is as follows. We have 20 black sources, which is way above and beyond what we really need. You need 18 to consistently cast Liliana of the Veil on curve, which is the benchmark for any BGX deck. We have 20. We're more than good there. We have 17 green sources, which we also, we want as many green as we can for Scavenging Ooze. And but if you look at the green demands in this deck, even from the sideboard, they're not that bad. So our green mana is well up to par. The only thing that's a minor concern is we only have 14 white sources. Now, according to Frank Karsten's seminal work, we only need 13 to cast Stoneforge Mystic consistently on curve. and even fewer to cast Lingering Souls on curve. We cannot cast turn 1 Path to Exile, but guess what? We don't really want to ever do that anyway, unless it's a really weird game, so that is totally fine. So while we could have more white sources, we still are mathematically going to be consistent enough to cast SFM on curve. The only thing we cannot cast on curve consistently in this deck is Gideon, ally of Zendikar. So for that reason, again, a slightly greedy choice of Treetop Village. If this Treetop was a Shambling Vent or a Stirring Wildwood, we would be much more likely to even cast Gideon on curve. But I think the risk levels are acceptable because Gideon's a powerful inclusion, but not one that necessarily demands to be included. So if he ends up not quite fitting, not being as good as I think, we can always just cut him, replace him with a different value-oriented permanent for the sideboard, and not have to change our mana base. Or if he proves to be really good, and or the Treetop Village proves to not be necessary, to be a little bit too greedy, well, we can replace it with a different creature land, one that produces white, and Gideon will be happier for that decision. So I think the mana base is like 95% or higher, as consistent as we could want, but I think we're making acceptable trade-offs in terms of a couple higher upside potential decisions at the expense of some slight consistency, but overall we're very consistent with the mana. Moving along, we have 3 and 3 on Inquisition and Thoughtseize, so right away this is a little bit of a questionable decision because for 2 reasons. Number 1, we are a 3-color BGX deck. We do have some painful mana development a lot of the time. It is therefore definitely viable, arguably better, to play 4 Inquisition, 2 Thoughtseize, especially because we do expect Burn to be a pretty heavy presence in the format. That said, we also expect Control and other mid-range decks playing 4-drops to have a decent presence, and perhaps most importantly, we expect big mana to shoot up significantly. For more on my thoughts on the meta, see 2 previous videos, the post-ban meta predictions, as where I go into depth on that. But in any case, that is why I am opting for the slightly riskier but slightly higher reward 3-3 split rather than the 4-2 split. That is the other common alternative. Part of the reason I'm comfortable doing this is because, of course, we do have some main deck life gain, some significant sources of main deck life gain, Shambling Vent, most notably Batterskull. We also have a couple Scavenging Oozes. So, but really Batterskull is what carries that decision. If I was playing Abzan before Stoneforge Mystic, I'd probably be on the 4-2, but we're going to try 3-3, see how it goes. The other thing I'll mention here is that Stoneforge Mystic is an extremely powerful but extremely clunky card, and very often it'll be your best play on turn 2. I think on average, Dark Confidant or Tarmogoyf is better turn 2 and Mystic is better late game. But you won't always have those other cards, and or they won't always be the right play. So if you do place turn 2 SFM and you're curving out with your lands, you will very often make your 3rd land drop and be holding up her activation for Batterskull or maybe Sword of Fire and Ice, and not really have anything great to do with your 3rd mana besides maybe holding up a reactive kill spell, if it's the right matchup for that. Therefore, even though I cut my 7th discard spell from Rock, you can see my previous video for my deck tech on Rock post-ban, I'm very interested in what Abzan could do, how well Abzan Stoneblade could leverage a 4th Inquisition of Kozilek and therefore a 7th 1-mana discard spell. I didn't end up doing it just because I'm a little bit newer to Abzan. I think that's a little bit of a radical decision for somebody who's not as experienced, but let me know, my friends, whether you think that has merit, whether we should explore that, and if so, what we could cut to fit in that 7th Inquisition. Very interesting decision point here for the deck building process, but moving along, we have 3 Fatal Push and 2 Path to Exile, and I actually also put the 4th Fatal Push in the board. I just think the White Splash, unless we're stabilizing with Batterskull, is a little bit softer to the go-wide strategies than Rock or Jund, unless, again, we can stabilize with Skull, or Lingering Souls is very good in that type of matchup. Even so, it definitely never hurts to have a very efficient kill spell and access to another one in your 75. Now, it's possible this should be a 3rd Path to Exile. I simply don't know. I simply don't know whether the 3rd path is better than the 4th push, or maybe we even play 4 pushes main and put the 2nd path side. I don't know. I don't think that's a game-winning or game-losing decision. I think we'll just kind of see what feels good as we play and see where the meta goes and where, therefore, our removal wants to go. But I do kind of like having access to 6 total. It's kind of mirroring the Jund 4-bolt 2-push. Here we've got 6 1-mana kill spells, so I do like it. Moving on to the 2-drop slot. Stoneforge Mystic, of course, is the reason Abzan is back on the map. Despite that, I am going straight to 3. I am not even going to mess around with testing 4. Now, if you want to test 4 just to see the card more often, to see how good that is, of course, I think that is perfectly viable. But I'm pretty confident, personally, I'm pretty confident that 4 in a deck like this is a little bit too much. It's a little too clunky. If you're playing 4, it kind of demands that you play 3 equipment, otherwise you are too unbalanced. You can have too many situations where you naturally draw your even 1 equipment, and then you cast your Stoneforge and the rest are just mostly squires. So rather than run into that, or rather than compensate for the 4th Stoneforge by playing a third piece of equipment main deck, I decided that I think the best path forward is to simply start with 3 and 2 pieces of equipment. I think that is the most balanced, and I think we already have other very good 2-drop threats in this archetype anyway. Don't get me wrong, Stoneforge gives it new life, it gives it a new dimension, it's definitely very powerful, but I believe 3 to be the correct number. And forgive the mismatched art, but it's an omen that I should be iterating with this deck, because in my recent Sultai Donation League, I actually did well enough to open a few chests, and this promo Stoneforge Mystic was in one of the 5 chests that I opened from that league. I already having owned these 2, so I was like, alright, that settles it. We've got to pick up the missing cards for Stoneblade, so here you go, there it is. The omen has been given. So, moving along from the 3 of Stoneblade, let's talk about the Stoneblade package since we're on it. These are kind of like the non-negotiable inclusions, in my opinion. Yes, you can get very techie by playing a different sword than Fire and Ice, but you know what? This is just the most universally good. Shocking any target, drawing a card when you connect, 2 relevant colors to have protection from. Yes, Pro Blue is not as relevant in Modern as it is in Legacy. It's still relevant, it still really is, but Pro Red is sweet, but really the on-hit effects are where it's at. I feel the Sword of Fire and Ice is the best main deck card, and then if you play a sword in your sideboard, which we'll get to discussing that later, that's when you want to be perhaps more concerned with the colors you have protection from, and a little less concerned with the effect, in my opinion. And then, of course, Batterskull is the single best equipment overall with Stoneforge Mystic, especially in the Modern format where your life total does matter. Your life total is under pressure from a lot of decks that try to aggro you out. What more can you ask than a turn 3 Batterskull for 2 mana? Well, 4 mana spread over 2 turns. It's a great discount. You can play it at instant speed. It's a very big roadblock, very big hurdle to those decks. And as any BGX veteran knows, oftentimes we just need a little bit of help to stabilize, and we'll have the inevitability from there. Well, Stoneforge into Batterskull will do that. So that's the Stoneblade package. But moving on in the 2-drop slot, we've got 2 copies of Dark Confidant. Now, I think I'm in the slight minority here in wanting to play Bobs and Abzan. Rock is the best Bob deck in the format, and Bob also has a lot more Predators these days, post-Modern Horizons, than he once did. However, Bob is, in my view, a good sword bearer, a good equipment wielder, because we do like the things that have gotten value upon ETB and or are getting you value over time in some way, shape, or form that then also become credible threats when equipped. That certainly applies to Dark Confidant, and I think only playing 2, we're not too likely to have them be too much of a liability. We're not likely to draw multiples when they're awkward, and because we have the inherent 2-for-1 of Stoneforge Mystic, we are also not as dependent on Dark Confidant's card advantage to compete on a value axis with a lot of decks. So I think 2 is the sweet spot. That said, this is perhaps one of the more contentious slots in the deck, and a really nice alternative is my namesake card, is the card Grim Flayer. So Grim Flayer is another 2-drop. It's a little more hardy, a little bit more resilient, especially if you can get Delirium online. The presence of artifacts does mean we can get Delirium a little bit more readily, but it's still kind of tough to get Delirium without building around it. In any case, it's an evasive attacker with that trample. It's got a great on-hit ability in its own right, to say nothing of the on-hit ability of a Sword of Fire and Ice. So Grim Flayer wielding the sword is just awesome. It's just very cool. It's a good proactive threat. Again, all the upsides we've mentioned over Bob, but it does not give card advantage. It only gives conditional card selection. That said, it also plays nicely with Lingering Souls, so if Bob ends up not working out, and or if I just want to test an alternative, I think at least one Grim Flayer, possibly two, replacing two Bobs, would be very, very viable in that slot. Scavenging Ooze does shine more in the rock, and I think now that the Hogak and Looting decks have gone from the format or have taken a significant hit, we can go back down to Skoos. I'm sure a lot of Abzan players were playing 3. I think we can go back down to 2. It's still a nice role player in the deck. It's still some nice glue and stability for the deck, and some incidental main deck hate for graveyard strategies or just graveyard value. So still like the 2 Skoos. 4 Tarmogoyf still feels non-negotiable in any BGX variant. However, a blasphemous part of my mind did wonder if we still need all 4 Tarmogoyf due to the fact that Stoneforge brings these things that turn anything into a threat. Tarmogoyf arguably benefiting least from Sword of Fire and Ice relative to other threats like Dark Confidant, but then again, Tarmogoyf with a Batter Skull connecting once, attacking or blocking against any regular aggro-based deck is basically GG, right? So, and of course, we will not always have the luxury of deploying, resolving, and activating Stoneforge Mystic undisrupted. So Goyf still, as a 4 of, to do Goyf things to be our most efficient 2-drop threat. 3 copies of Assassin's Trophy. I did decide to lean more heavily on this than playing a mix of Trophy and Decay. Slots are just at a premium, and we're just going to play the card that really does catch everything, even if it's not optimal. We might be taxing their basics if they're a greedy deck with few basics between paths and trophies, so maybe the downside will be mitigated over the course of casting a few, but you can't really go wrong with trophies in my opinion. It's possible there's a better configuration, maybe 2 trophy, 1 decay, but with big mana on the rise, I decided let's just start with 3 trophy and then take it from there. Lingering Souls. Lingering Souls is a great value card. In the past, it was arguably the biggest single incentive to play Abzan because it was the mid-range mirror breaker. Those days are behind us. Plague Engineer has made sure of that. Plague Man, and but prior to the bans anyway, lots of incidental grave hate flying around, plus the format just being faster and faster. All of these things have helped Lingering Souls, have forced Lingering Souls' stock to fall. That said, it is given a new lease on life, in my opinion, along with the archetype as a whole, thanks to Stoneforge Mystic, because Lingering Souls is excellent at being equipped. It's 4 bodies for 1 card. You can equip them. They're expendable if you force the opponent to remove them to stall your connections with a sword. That's a good thing overall for your value axis. And so that said, all of the downsides that I mentioned, all of the reasons it's not as great as it maybe used to be, are still true. Therefore, I am only on 2. I think the 3-drop slot is already pretty crowded, especially because Stoneforge Mystic is very mana intensive for a 2-drop. So I'm only playing with three souls, but I think we should include some in a Stoneblade deck for sure, so 2 copies seems like a nice sweet spot. And incidentally, that also plays well with Liliana of the Veil, who can of course take up pitching a souls, which means that we had basically an asymmetrical discard effect, which is always what we want to try to achieve with her. And in her own right, she is excellent. She is excellently positioned right now, in my opinion, post-Hogak. I personally, with the exception of a Sultai deck with a lot of permission, like the one I played in my recent donation league, I would start basically any BGX deck with 4 Liliana of the Veil. I think she's very good right now. Abzan Stoneblade, no exception. Moving on, Tireless Tracker. So Tracker is one reason that we are benefiting from the decision to play 24 lands, which I don't believe I mentioned. So 23 lands is viable, but I like 24 because 24, Stoneforge Mystic can be mana hungry, especially if they kill her and we have Batterskull stranded in hand. We want to curve out with our lands. We want to make our 5th land drop a lot of the games to cast hard cast the Skull. And that 24th land in the deck just opens up the ability to play more utility lands and make them less of a liability because we have more land drops overall. And it makes Tireless Tracker really nice. Tireless Tracker in a 24 land deck, I can tell you, feels very good no matter what strategy it is. Just a really nice inevitability tool in the mid to late game. It's a threat that doubles as card advantage. It carries a sword just fine, and she's even doing so in the artwork, right? So Tireless Tracker, really nice, kind of sharing the card advantage duty with Dark Confidant and Stoneforge Mystic. And note that the 3-2-2 split of those cards means that we're unlikely to see any of them in multiples where they become liabilities. Stoneforge Mystic in multiples means you are much likelier to run out of a tutor target, and you just don't usually need more than one SFM. Dark Confidant in multiples is a liability for obvious reasons, and Tireless Tracker is just often too slow in multiples. Even if the game is slow, you don't really need more than one because you want a different dimension. You want to find other things with your cards, usually besides a second tracker. So keeping the numbers of all those low, I really like that 3-2-2 split of our card advantage engines in the main deck. And finally, rounding things out, good old-fashioned Maelstrom Pulse. You really can never go wrong with this card. I played 2 for the longest time in my rock lists of old. And I even recently have seen a couple rock lists and maybe even an Abzan list, if I'm not mistaken, 5-0ing with 2 Maelstrom Pulse in the main deck. Even me in the past, I was playing 1-1 split main and side. The card's viable. It's just very, very viable. It's a good catch-all. You will basically never catch me registering a deck of my own creation in the BGX archetype without one of these, so there you go. That's our main deck. That's our 60 as always, my friends. Any questions, any suggestions, any points of clarification, anything you disagree with, I would love to hear about it. We'll talk about it in the comments, but first, let's talk about the sideboard. So, right away, Gideon, ally of Zendikar, is kind of a standout card. I don't usually play Abzan, so it's not one I'm used to running, of course, but Gideon is very good with the Stoneblade package because he churns out knights for fun. They are all very good sword wielders, and Gideon himself can, of course, even pick up the sword and go to battle, right? And Gideon, of course, is kind of... his presence has waxed and waned, but since his printing, he's been a fairly constant presence in Modern as just like a good old-fashioned value-oriented card, right? You want a card that generates value and is decent in a variety of matchups? Well, Gideon is your guy. And I think that's even truer now than it has been in the past, simply because a lot of the green-black planeswalkers were thinking of otherwise great cards like Liliana the Last Hope, Vraska Golgari Queen. If you notice, when you tick them down, they end up at 1 loyalty, which is very bad against Renin 6, if we're thinking about the Jund matchup, and Jund arguably still being the premier mid-range deck despite Stoneforge Mystic, right? So Gideon, ally of Zendikar himself, is not vulnerable to Renin 6, nor are his knight allies, so that's a very nice thing in a Renin 6 meta, and yeah, therefore I think Gideon is a perfectly valuable play here. Again, with the possible caveat of not having the 15th land, making him a little less likely to be cast on curve than we would otherwise hope. Speaking of planeswalkers who are well positioned, Ashiok Dreamrender. I talked about this card at length in my BG Rock deck tech, but if you haven't seen that, I expect big mana to rise enormously. Ashiok is very good against Tron, especially on the play, and is amazing against Valakut decks and against Amulet Titan. Also has a wide variety of other matchups where it has a decent impact, and perhaps just as importantly, we hope that the graveyard decks, and we expect that the graveyard decks are going to be, number 1, less numerous in the meta, and number 2, less explosive, less consistent as well. So all of those factors combined mean that Ashiok is actually very reasonable supplementary graveyard hate these days. Whereas in the Hogak meta, in the looting meta, Ashiok, you'd still bring this card in if it was in your 75, of course, for the graveyard decks, but really it was a rare occasion where it would be fast enough to matter. But nowadays, I think the graveyard hate on Ashiok matters, and of course the big mana utility is real. Next up, arguably the single coolest card in my view in the sideboard, and one of the more appealing reasons to play Abzan Stoneblade is this fine fellow named Gaddock Teague. So, Collector Oof shows us the benefit, how it's often more of a feature than a bug, that your hate piece is on a bear. It's a hate piece on legs. Yes, cards like Oof and Teague are easier, on average, for an opposing deck to remove than if they were, for example, an enchantment. But that's not always true. You know, sometimes these decks will side in like Nature's Claim or whatever, and you're just beating them down with your 2/2 hate piece, right? So, if nothing else, we know the value of being proactive. We know the value of putting a clock on when all else fails. You attack with your 2/2s, and it can get you over the line or help get you there. So, Gaddock Teague, a really unique hate piece, a really interesting hate piece. And as we know from our experience with Oof, it can be more of a feature than a bug that is on a 2/2 creature rather than on a static artifact or enchantment that cannot increase the clock. And guess what, guys? You know, we are a sword deck. We are a Batterskull deck. Gaddock Teague is a man of peace. He's a man of peace. He's a diplomat. He's an advisor. He wants to talk it out. But even Gaddock Teague has its limits, and he's not afraid to pick up the sword and go to war if the situation is dire. So our man Teague in the sideboard for sure. Definitely a nice one. Moving on, we've got to still respect the graveyard decks to some degree. Where's the rest of my sideboard, by the way? There we go. Okay. I was like, wait a minute, we're looking a little thin on the sideboard here. That's because these cards are hiding out over here. I saw the Surgical and was like, yeah, I think I should have a Spellbomb in here too. Clicking is hard. There we go. So, in any case, let's put the Spellbomb here next to the Surgical. We are respecting the continued presence of graveyard decks. Dredge is still a deck. There will be other rogue decks, hopefully not Living End for our sake, but other rogue graveyard decks that were just kind of pushed out of the meta by Hogak, and Looting Dredge and other things being a superior choice, but they're still going to be around. We've got to stay prepared for them. So Nile Spellbomb, obviously good against graveyard decks. It's good against Jund these days. It's good against Control. It can come in other corner case scenarios as well. Love the card. It replaces itself. It's value-oriented. It usually grows our Tarmogoyf. What's not to like? Surgical Extraction. It's nice to be able to have a free cast that interacts with our graveyard, so we can go like turn 1 Inquisition, turn 2 Skoos, which is going to set us up to start taking over the game against graveyard decks by turn 3, but sometimes that's too slow. But if you have Surgical backing it up to stem the tide and allow us to safely untap on turn 3, it can be enough. Surgical will also flex into big mana matchups. You Fulminator their land, their Tron land, you Surgical them all away. Same with Valakut, good against Amulet Titan, good against combo decks, good against Neoform. One of my most satisfying wins in a recent Modern League was turn 1 Thoughtseize your Allosaurus Rider, Surgical them, the opponent just scoops in response. Gotta love it. So those cards are in the deck, and we also, as mentioned earlier, have the one of Fatal Push. Just seems like a fine hedge against burn, against humans, against anything that dies to Fatal Push. It's even, depending on our exact configuration, good in mid-range mirrors and stuff like that. We do have a copy of Collective Brutality. I would have liked to find room for one more, because I do expect burn to be on the rise, and whether the second one would be main or side, it would just be a comfort to have it. It does play nicely, of course, with Lingering Souls and all that stuff. Didn't quite have room for it, but of course, my friends, if you have suggestions, you can feel free to let me know about that. But one of Collective Brutality, nice glue for the deck, even in the sideboard, and 2 copies of Plague Engineer. So those who have watched my content at all lately know how high I am on the card. I am trying to, like, my supporters will send me a donation league, and I'm like, it needs more Plague Men, and I'm like never not on 4 on the Rock when I build my own list for the Rock. It's just, the card is just amazing. That said, for whatever reason, it does feel a little less impactful in Abzan than it does in other archetypes. Maybe that's just me. And furthermore, I play enough Plague Engineer and enough other archetypes that I kind of want to test other cards here. That said, I'm still on 2, because he's still just that good. So Plague Engineer, awesome, awesome card. 2 copies of Collector Roof. I'm all the way up to 3 on the rock. It's only 2 here just because we have more things that we need to do with a third color in the deck, and also because there is the non-bow to worry about with our own, not only the Stoneblade package, but 2 trackers main deck as well. The oof is just a little bit less of a free inclusion, plus we have kind of the third oof, basically, even though they don't go in all the same matchups. It's a similar principle in Gaddock Teague, right? So only 2 oof, but the card is spectacularly well positioned for the coming weeks, in my opinion. Finally, we have Fulminator Mage. Feels a little bit weird to have not only the trophies, but also the paths, which in some cases will kind of feel like spinning our wheels if we spend a spell stone raining them with Fulminator, and then we spend a spell ramping them with trophy or path. Not that Fulminator and path will be in the most matchups together, but at least Fulminator and trophy will. But that's kind of an inherent little non-bow to the deck. That doesn't mean we shouldn't play this very good card or this very good card. And again, with big mana expected to be on the rise, we can't really leave home without 3 Fulminator, in my opinion, unless we've got another really good plan for those types of decks. Finally, we have this decision, Sword of Feast and Famine. Now, I will be clear about this. I don't believe it to be necessary, or even necessarily optimal, to play a sword in your Stoneblade sideboard. I don't think it's completely necessary at all. That said, I am eager to try it, not only to see how well Sword of Feast and Famine itself does, but how well it feels to side in a third piece of equipment while still only being on 3 Stoneforge Mystic. Now, I think the Batterskull and Fire and Ice are simply what you should just play main deck, and I think there are 4 total swords probably that are more or less fine in your sideboard. Light and Shadow is very, very interesting. Sinew and Steel is definitely appealing. Maybe 1 or 2 others, but I have opted for Feast and Famine simply because, number 1, those protection colors are quite relevant, and number 2, I mentioned the clunk of Abzan, the clunk of Stoneforge Mystic, and how, we kind of have to play a lot of 3 drops because we have to curve out and have permanents that are actually, or plays that are actually valuable enough to take over the game, but it can all end up being a little bit clunky, which is why we were thinking about maybe a 7th discard spell. Well, Sword of Feast and Famine helps you really flood the mid-game with just, you're almost time walking, right? You're almost time walking. You're getting that much advantage if you connect. You have your second main phase where you untap all your lands and you can make even more plays, or you can hold up effects. And that's very good when we have creature lands, when we have the canopy lands, and when we have the instant speed activation of Mystic, to say nothing of just holding up spells like Trophy or Push, right? Or simply playing a second play main phase. You can even animate a creature land, equip it, spend 5 mana to do so, and then you get to untap it all and have a second main phase. It's great. So, pretty cool stuff, and of course, this is really going to shine in attrition-based matchups against other mid-range decks and against control, and potentially against big mana if we can disrupt them a little bit earlier, just by, the same reason Liliana's +1 is good. We're forcing them to discard, we're running them out of resources. Seems worth testing to me. Again, both specifically Sword of Feast and Famine and a alternative sword in general. They both seem like they're worth testing. But if you want to start playing your Abzan deck and you don't feel like you need a sword, or you feel you need a 15th card more than that, by all means, I don't see this as necessary at all. I'm just going to give it a shot and see how I like it. And we'll also see what I'm missing from the sideboard as the meta develops, and maybe sword will have to make way for a missing card, or maybe some other cards won't work out as much and we can keep a sword around. We'll have to see. But in any case, my friends, that is my take on Abzan Stoneblade. Again, not the most experienced Abzan player at all. I've just taken this through several casual games. I haven't played it through a league yet, but I have played hundreds of competitive league matches with The Rock. I've played many competitive league matches now with other BGX archetypes. via donation leagues and so forth on the channel. I've got a ton of BGX experience, and I've tried to bring it all to bear with building this Abzan Stoneblade deck, but make no mistake, we will be playing this through some leagues in the near future. But before I even did that, I wanted to bring you my thoughts on this, because people are asking me all about it, what to do with Abzan, what to do with Rock, what the meta is going to look like, and I want to bring you this content as soon as possible. I don't on this channel like to wait and see what other people are going to say, and then kind of mimic them or hedge toward them just so I'm not sticking my neck out. Like, I'm just giving you my honest thoughts, and whether they're right or whether they're wrong, only time will tell. But together, I think we can make BGX as strong as it can be. So let me know, my friends, what you think about my decisions here. Let me know what you've been up to with Abzan Stoneblade or with other BGX decks. And stay tuned to the channel, because we're going to play this deck soon, maybe with some changes based on your feedback. Maybe someone's got a donation league coming up. They want their own twist on it to be played. But we're going to play some Stoneblade one way or another. And we're going to play some Rock, and we're going to keep jamming more BGX variants. And we're going to keep bringing you this theoretical type of content. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments below. If you do enjoy this content, my friends, Patreon link is in the description. That is the best way to give back to me. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel. Watch the ads, click on the ads. Any little bit does help me. It makes a huge difference in my life, and I would dearly appreciate it. So thanks again, and let me know what you think. I will talk to you soon. Hope everyone out there has a wonderful day.